If you simply look at the definition of a hero, it is a person who is admired or idealized for courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. Attack on Titan shows us this definition, quite literally, namely in the form of Reiner Braun and, to another extent, Eren Yeager. Reiner's actions are not motivated by selfless care and goodness, as many may expect of a hero. Rather, they are rooted in his deep desire for love and respect. Even Eren is an example of how destructive the classic hero archetype can actually be when translated to reality. But AOT doesn't just take the concept of a hero and pry it apart. It asks us to redefine what a hero is. Jean Kirstein shows us that the concept of a hero doesn't need to be shiny or toxic. He's flawed. Jean is selfish. He's not even remotely fearless. On the surface, he seems like the furthest thing from a hero. But instead of making him an unlikable character, Jean actually grows into one of the more relatable and hopeful depictions of a hero in recent memory. Jean shows us that the true quality of a person isn't dependent on how pure, smart, bold, or naturally gifted they are. Rather, it is measured by the strength a person has in managing their own human nature, in order to do what they know is right. Jean's earliest years were spent in the safety of trust. From a young age, his mother doted on him, showing her love for her son through cooking and always being a shoulder for him to cry on. A part of me believes that Jean was used to spending his time alone as a child. From the flashback of him as a kid coming home crying to his mom, I can't help but wonder if Jean had a really difficult time making friends as a kid. Perhaps this harder childhood aided in making him the brutally honest, abrasive person that he is by time we meet him in the Cadet Corps. It would also explain Jean's independent character. But as smug as he may seem, Jean is still a very caring person. Something I also think could stem from a childhood of being bullied, where the only person who really understood him was his mom. Jean has always displayed a strong moral compass, taking initiative to help people where he can. We see this early on in his life when he makes a meal for his sick mother, on his own initiative too. But in turn, we also see that Jean has always harbored a lot of self-doubt. His mom calls him a good kid, and you can see him shrug away from the compliment. As much of an arrogant person as he seems to be, Jean has a lot of insecurities, which is very common, I think, with arrogant types. There's always more going on underneath the surface. But despite his abrasiveness, Jean is quite smart and opportunistic. He's already aware of how corrupt the military police are, and his motivation for joining the Cadet Corps comes from his desire to play that system. Jean wants as far from the outer walls as possible, far from the brutality of the Titans. Jean is not like Eren in the sense that Eren came out of his childhood of being bullied and his traumatic experiences with his hopes about the world somewhat intact. Jean, I think, lost them long ago. But one of the most important things that happens in Jean's past is that he drew a particular picture. This picture is based on the face of a girl that he saw in his dreams, and he rushes to get her face on paper before she fades from memory. This mysterious, dark-haired girl became one of his strongest desires. This is Jean's literal dream girl, and I think he believed, somehow, that his path to the military police would lead him to her. And, in a way, he wasn't far off. Jean begins his stretch in the military as a punk. He talks up a large game about joining the military police and all that. And he doesn't hide from the other cadets that he is there entirely to serve his own interests. This is, on the surface, contrasted by Eren Yeager, who views his aim to join the Survey Corps through an idealistic lens. Eren looks at it like he's helping to save humanity. But Jean is realistic, and he's also honest about what he wants, and how stupid he thinks Eren is for thinking he can annihilate all the Titans. Jean dislikes the idea of mindlessly throwing yourself at an ideal, something that Eren regularly does and advocates for. To Jean, this is disingenuous and unrealistic, and he will call out the hypocrisy of idealism in whoever he encounters it in, while Eren, conversely, calls out the corruption that surrounds them in the world of the walls, and Jean's complacency towards it. At this point, the two are very much opposites. But Jean is also envious of Eren's strength of will. Jean nicknames Eren Suicidal Maniac during their time in cadets. Eren, in turn, considers Jean a coward. And while Jean is self-interested and abrasive, and a more or less self-professed coward, he is still a top soldier. Jean is very good at whatever he sets his mind to, especially after Eren humbles him for slacking on his hand-to-hand combat, a skill Jean deemed unnecessary when it came to joining the military police. That Jean was then able to push himself to rank 6th in his class is notable, considering how the top 10 cadets primarily consists of people with prior military experience, with Titan shifting healing abilities, or just even being a downright war goddess mutant. Jean, perhaps used to being smarter and more capable than most back in his childhood, realized he was out of his element among his fellow cadets, and he was forced to grow. Instead of hiding from the pains of adversity or his wounded pride, Jean shows that he is capable of overcoming such challenges very early on in the story, an essential trait for his later development. Despite Jean's self-professed selfishness, he also isn't someone who exercises willful blindness, even when he really wants to. Despite Jean's tendency to look out for himself, his sense of right and wrong is stronger. This sense of morality doesn't come from concern for how others will think of him either. Jean isn't someone who is easily influenced by others, nor does he have a desire for praise or recognition even. Jean has a strong sense of self, demonstrated by how easily he can be honest about the selfish things he wants. He doesn't care what other people think. But ultimately, Jean's honesty translates in his ability to see the writing on the wall, so to speak. As the outside world and all its terrible horrors are closing in around him, Jean knows he can't just stick his head in the sand and ignore it. Not only does Jean have a strong sense of self, he is also not a passive person. I think Jean has an assertive nature, but that assertive nature has been covered and held back by his self-doubts, his own insecurities. The Trost arc is where those chains begin to break. The day is fast approaching for when Jean and the other cadets get to choose which regiment they will be joining. Jean is looking forward to his long, cozy, easy life with the military police, tucked in the interior walls. But the night before, Eren snaps and makes a speech, criticizing his comrades for giving up on a fight because they think they can't win. Eren argues that with each loss, knowledge about the enemy and how to deal with them is gained, and that for each of the trained recruits to not put their skills towards the betterment of humanity and hide from the Titans, they are morally in the wrong. Jean scoffs, sitting quietly by himself, trying to dismiss Eren's words, But this speech, despite his initial attempts to dismiss it and ignore it, sticks with him for the remainder of the series. As I mentioned earlier, we see Jean's overall caring nature with how he simply just made his mom food when she was sick. He does this because it's the right thing to do. He wants to help his mom. But when his mom expresses that she thinks her son is a good kid, Jean clearly doesn't think that highly of himself. He carries this tendency to doubt himself into the cadets, which I think explains why he's so determined to go to the military police. After all, why would a kid who doesn't believe in himself feel like he'd be any use against any Titans? So, when the walls of Trost, Jean's hometown, are busted in by the colossal Titan, Jean is horrified. Now he is forced to face the very Titans he's been working to avoid. A battle that initially seemed completely hopeless. Jean has a moment of complete despair along with all the other cadets when their gas reserves are almost completely out and nobody is coming to resupply them. The only person to suggest making a very risky break to headquarters where the gas reserves are stored is Connie. But Jean dismisses this idea at first. He says they don't have a leader, so they don't have a chance. But after seeing Mikasa run off on her own towards HQ, he can't help but recall Eren's words. Even if things seem impossible, they have to try. There's of course Jean's crush on Mikasa, but I will be getting to that later on in the video. Despite his own terror and reluctance, Jean rallies and rouses his comrades and spurs them all forward to join her. He realizes, however, that many cadets will not survive this run. Their very deaths will ensure the remainder of the cadets' survival. This is something that fills Jean with immense guilt, as he feels responsible. He's the one who spurred everybody on. Jean lashes out at the soldiers who cowered inside HQ instead of resupplying the people outside. Their actions, or lack of action, led to a lot of unnecessary deaths. Marco is the only one who holds Jean back. But before we continue talking about the Trost plotline, we do need to talk about Marco. Marco is one of the nicest characters in the whole story of Attack on Titan. He was seen as a leader among his fellow cadets, and he always treated everybody with respect and kindness. Marco had a way of seeing the best in a person, and a natural magnetism that even Jean responded to. If Jean was bullied as a kid or had difficulty making friends, which he clearly does by the time he joins the military, suddenly having a friend like Marco would be like the difference between night and day. Because Marco treated him with respect and kindness. He didn't just see the abrasive jerk. Marco actually tells Eren during training in an OVA episode that he thinks Jean will surpass him in leadership. This is something that Eren scoffs at, and it's understandable why. But it's still really important that Marco notices something in Jean. He sees a spark. He begins to believe in Jean. During the Trost incident, Marco is actually given command of his own squad. But even he resigns to death when their gas supply runs low. He and the others decide to sit out the remainder of their lives waiting for death, until Jean gets everybody inspired enough to move. Marco even says to Jean following this, how Jean has what it takes to lead. But not because Jean is fearless, rather it is his fear that makes him such a good leader. In Jean pushing past his own hurdles, he shows those around him that they too are strong enough to overcome themselves. Instead of Jean letting his weaknesses paralyze him, he is decisive and takes action. Jean takes this to heart, but you can still tell that he's got that self-doubt. He doubts Marco's belief in him. But before Jean can speak to Marco again, after Trost is finally secured, he finds his friend's mangled body, just lying in the streets. Jean is in shock, seeing this positive, encouraging, intelligent person, someone Jean believed was destined for a good life behind the walls, now having been half-eaten by a Titan, dying alone and almost certainly terrified. And Jean just managing to stutter Marco's name to a nurse. Marco is almost reduced to a simple name on a casualty list. One of the most important aspects of this whole scene, for me at least, is how nondescript Marco's body almost is. Like, he still has his hairstyle, but other than that, it's like who he is secondary in this scene, at least to me. Not in the way that makes you doubt it's Marco, but in the way that Marco's body helps to hammer home to the viewer the realization that Jean is having. That what happened to Marco could have happened to him. It could have happened to anybody so easily. It didn't matter that Marco was a leader that the cadets all thought would rise in the military police ranks. It didn't matter how kind and caring a person Marco was. In the end, his brutal death shows to Jean just how mercilessly his life could have been snuffed out too. The world doesn't operate on who deserves to live or die. It's indiscriminate and unfair and cruel. And I think Jean carries some survivor's guilt for the remainder of the series from the death of his closest friend. In this period, he's thinking, why is Marco dead? What is the point? What is the reason? But there isn't one. It's such a terrible thing, it doesn't make sense. And I think Jean is trying to reconcile that within himself. Later that night, Jean stands before the communal pyre with the rest of the surviving recruits. He picks up a bone fragment in his right hand, a hand you can see him bring to his lips before jumping into battle during the female Titan arc. Jean silently acknowledges that he doesn't even know if this bone fragment he's holding in his hand is even Marco's. Jean never wants to face the horrors of the Titans ever again. But in Marco's body being fed to the fire, Jean rises from his ashes with a new resolve. Marco's death, along with Eren's earlier speech, hammers home the truth of the world that has come pouring through the walls. As frightened as Jean is, and as much as he wants a peaceful life, he is realistic. Jean knows that to ignore the truth that he has seen today, to run away from it, and leave others to handle it, isn't right. Willful blindness isn't all that different from idealism in a way. As terrified as Jean is, he cannot live with the guilt of having chosen to do nothing. Marco believed in him to do the right thing as well. When Jean turns to his surviving comrades, he does not try to hide his terror when he tells them that he will be joining the Scouts. He's actively struggling to stay true to this decision, and he nearly falters when the time comes. He is so tempted by his desire to hide in the inner walls, to exist under the facade of his dream. Especially after all he's just experienced, you can't really fault him for that. And the thing that I really like about this struggle is that it's not like Jean has just forgotten all these things that he wants, or has completely ditched all his fears. They're still there, and they're a struggle that he has to deal with. There's just too many stories where they chuck away a character's fears and everything like they didn't exist, and it's like, that's not realistic. Jean has to fight against his fear to stay this course, along with Connie and Sasha. These three characters are the only characters who display immense fear and reluctance with their decision to join the Survey Corps. But a part of me thinks that what gives Connie and Sasha the strength to remain committed is Jean. Being the most arrogant and self-serving among the surviving cadets, him sticking to doing what he knows is right has a lot of weight. This reflects what Marco said about him, how people follow Jean because of his strength in facing his weakness. This is where Jean's arc really gets going, embarking on the challenging path of becoming an unintentional, unsung hero. The very kind, in fact, that other characters in Attack on Titan try and fail to be. In the Survey Corps, Jean spends a lot of his early arc dispelling the coward label, not out of spite for Eren, but for his own sake. Jean regularly wrestles his fear of Titans, of the brutal deaths of those around him, making him want to run scared behind the walls. But he forms bonds with his fellow soldiers. This helps Jean to remember Marco's belief in him. Jean feels protective over his friends, which helps him overcome his personal struggles. People who once made fun of him in the Cadet Corps, like Eren, begin to respect Jean for his decisive action and honesty. Something very valuable in a life or death situation, traits that befit a leader. Quite possibly one of the first moments where this side of Jean really shines is when he speaks for all the Survey Corps in reminding Eren that they are depending on him. Jean hammers the fact that Eren needs to recognize how important it is that he does his absolute best with his newfound Titan abilities. Because every other person there is putting their lives on the line for him, and Eren should not take that for granted. Instead of this being received with hostility from Eren, he can see how much the other soldiers respond to this truth. Calling back to when Marco told Eren that Jean has far better potential as a leader than he himself does. Jean is there again to give Eren a reality check, both in the Female Titan arc and the Clash of the Titans arc. He makes sure Eren realizes that he cannot let his comrades risk their lives and die in vain. I think a large part of this side of Jean is his own personal resolve that Marco's death cannot be left to be meaningless. Marco is so much more than just ashes and bones, as is everybody else who perished in Trost that day. If Eren can't make the change they all hope for, with countless people dying to make it happen, then what was any of this for? That's a lot to put on Eren, for sure, but you get where Jean is coming from. They've come too far to turn back now. Another thing too is that Jean isn't just jumping into battle mindlessly. He's not just a soldier that does what he's told. Jean questions things. He often considers the what and why of what the Survey Corps is doing. He is baffled by Erwin's strategy of disseminating false information about Eren's location during the Female Titan arc. Though Armin explains that this was a necessary gamble, Jean questions the morality of paying for truth with lives. Armin and Jean are two sides of a leadership coin, with Armin being more adept at long-term, top-down strategy, and Jean being more suited to in-the-moment, on-the-ground action. We see more of this dynamic throughout the series, though it's interesting to see the difference in morality calls between them. Especially considering that, at face value, you have someone who seems like a kind, sweet nerd versus the jaded jerk. Their sensitivities are the opposite of what you'd expect. Armin is the Crimson King, after all. I love Slap on Titan so much. Also, after Annie encases herself in her crystal, when Eren finally defeats her, Jean is devastated. Without Marco there to hold him back, Jean breaks his sword trying to get to her. But Jean's anger isn't so much from a place of vengeance, even knowing that Annie had an unknown role in Marco's death. It's that Jean wants answers. Nobody knows exactly what happened with Marco and what all the carnage is even for. It's very fitting that this is his main motivation, as Marco's last words, at least in the sub, are, "But we haven't even had the chance to talk this through," which breaks my heart every time I hear it. The question as to why Marco had to die is one that haunts Jean. But Jean is someone who is able to keep his cool in even stressful situations. His ability to do this improves with each part of the story. When Reiner and Bertolt are revealed as the armored and colossal titans, Jean is angry and confused. These were people he trained and fought alongside for years. Jean once again rallies his fellow scouts as they pursue them and the captive Eren through the woods, and deeper into Titan territory. He joins the rest of the scouts in getting right up in Reiner's face, demanding to have answers from him and Bertolt if any of their friendship had even been real. to try and puzzle why they did everything they did, yet could still sleep next to them in the bunkhouse. Did they feel any guilt? Did they feel any shame? As terrified as he almost certainly is of the surrounding Titans, and as much as he and Eren may have had their differences, Jean still puts himself in harm's way to both get Eren back and get some answers. Jean is also able to manage his own terror and put himself into harm's way to save his comrades. He leaps in to save Mikasa when she's crushed in a Titan's hand, as well as to try and save Armin's life from the female Titan. Despite this near miss, Jean still dives right back into combat against Annie in their final fight against her in Stohess. He actually notes how all the newest military police members stand around, all frozen and afraid. Jean remarks, both with incredulity and a touch of envy, at how close he'd been to being one of them. Despite these mixed feelings, he still spurs himself on to join the thick of the fight. I also love that Jean doesn't hang by the sidelines, he just decides to get it over with and get in there. He faces danger straight up, but Jean would soon realize that maybe a life inside the walls would not have been as safe or as sane as he initially thought. Titans are one thing, but humans are still somehow scarier. This is a reality Jean never thought he'd have to face, and the Royal Coup arc forces him to redefine his limits yet again. In the months following the betrayal of Reiner and Bertolt, smashing Paradise's perception of the outside world, government tensions are flaring. In the Survey Corps' attempts to hide Historia Reiss and Eren, Levi's squad, including Jean, ultimately loses them in a street fight in Trost. Jean and Armin attempt to take the wagon their comrades are being held in, but Jean hesitates in killing one of their attackers, a member of the military police, despite Levi's orders. Jean tries telling her to stay down, but Armin is forced to shoot mere moments before their attacker was going to kill Jean. This near-fatal hesitation haunts Jean, not because he blames himself for losing Eren, which a part of him definitely does, but because Armin, now racked with guilt, had to get his hands dirty on Jean's behalf. Armin, like Jean, had also never killed another person, and Jean resolves to never hesitate again. And I think another part of Jean's hesitation in that moment, and his subsequent character hardening, comes from a very similar bit of perspective that we also saw exercised around Marco's death. I think Jean sees how easily that member of the military police could have been him, had he chosen differently. He came very, very close, after all. In another world, maybe they would have known that girl. Maybe they would have trained with her. I think a part of Jean even questions if he made the right decision in not joining the military police. Killing is bad, and Jean knows and feels this. And now that he's forced into a position where he has to kill other people in order to survive, he's deeply questioning if that makes him a bad person, just as many of the scouts are asking themselves that very same question. I think what keeps Jean afloat, while he has this debate within himself yet still has to continue to act, is simply just the goal of protecting the people he cares about. It's not about winning. This further steels him to do everything he can to protect his friends and not let them down with his hesitation, while also being forced into a whole other situation of intrigue and corruption and man's inhumanity to man and all that. There's a whole lot of moral crashing going on around Jean right now. And it's very rough for him because he's not like Armin. It's a lot harder for Jean to see the light at the end of the tunnel with all this. As a result, Jean's time in the royal government arc really strengthens his bonds with his comrades. He is determined to always take the worst in place of his friends, rather than watch them, like Armin, take it for him. He holds military police prisoners at gunpoint, and when Marlowe and Hitch find them in the woods, Jean is the one who offers to deal with them, using the opportunity to question Marlowe and Hitch to see how true their motives are as military police for helping out the Survey Corps. This is an interesting little moment, as Jean was once an aspiring MP himself, and he asks why someone who has that good life in the inner city, like Marlowe, would even want to help them. When Marlowe answers that so long as they keep risking their lives in the Survey Corps and fighting for their freedom, he will support them. I think this is a really cool moment because it almost reaffirms to Jean that he did make the right choice in joining the Survey Corps. He still holds on to the question of how good a life he could have had if he'd decided to become an MP, especially after his moral debacle over killing people. Throughout this whole arc, the Scouts all struggle with whether their killing of others in order to survive makes them bad people or not. But to have a military police member like Marlowe, who also happens to remind Jean of Aaron, tell him this honest opinion restores Jean's faith that he made the right decision. It also helps him to accept the nature of the conflict and struggle that he is now a part of. It's not that Jean is a good or a bad person, it's just the fact that this whole situation is a mess. At Jean's core, his sense of humanity is still strong. He's still the same person that questions whether victory, won with the cost of human lives and his own humanity, is even worth it. In the final assault to get Aaron and Historia back, Jean carries out his resolution to protect his friends, taking his first human life without hesitation. Under pressure and in a very short period of time, Jean comes a long way. And it's because he knew, after accepting reality, he had no other choice but to grow. After this point, and technically after only being with the Scouts for a matter of months, Jean serves as a bit of a reality check to the new recruits, namely Marlowe and Flock. Jean tries to temper their excitement and ease by reminding them that they have yet to see a Titan. He's not trying to rain on their parade, but he's trying to knock some sense into them. Jean's experience in joining the Survey Corps was not on the coattails of a fantastic victory, so he wasn't going in blind to the Survey Corps. He even says that unlike Aaron, he can serve as a form of guidance to new people. But Jean, as he did in the earliest days of their Survey Corps tenure, still serves to remind Aaron of what he needs to do, which is a valuable thing, considering how difficult it's becoming for Aaron to keep his focus. Jean is a very valuable advisor, in a way, compared with Armin and Mikasa, who are more devoted to protecting Aaron. Jean has no reservations about telling him the harder truth. What once was annoying when they were younger is what makes Jean so valuable now. Jean plays an especially important role in leading Connie and Sasha in the Shiganshina arc. He leads them in firing thunder spears at Reiner's nape, which blows him up but doesn't kill him because Reiner just can't be allowed to die. Jean is gloating over Reiner's presumably dead body until he sees that Connie and Sasha are crying. Jean is torn between his recent desensitization to killing and the very reason that Connie and Sasha are in tears, the fact that Reiner was once their friend, and thinking that they had just killed him. Jean does his best to hold back his own tears at this point in order to keep Connie and Sasha focused, but I don't think we ever see Jean ever gloat over death again. Jean's ability to continue to handle the present situation, especially after Bertolt changes into his colossal form, is what leads to Armin giving temporary command of the situation to him. Not only is this whole mission a strategic disaster at this point, there's the added difficulty of having to face their old friends. Armin needs time to formulate a proper plan. Jean does his best to act against Bertolt, though all of his plans unfortunately fail. This is largely due to the fact that Jean is not a big-brain strategic thinker. so much as he is a very valuable in-the-moment thinker. A weakness this incident makes him admit to, though this still buys enough time for Armin to develop a plan to deal with Berthold. Jean, in turn, leads an attack with Mikasa against Reiner. Jean is narrowly saved by Hanji, while Mikasa successfully carries out the plan and they neutralize Reiner. Jean, despite being injured and no doubt wrestling with feelings of anger himself, stops Hanji from killing him. Jean calls back to Eren's earlier speech in Season 1 concerning the knowledge they get from each loss, and the information Reiner could give them. And hey, the Armored Titan is a bonus. All of these things could give the walls a better chance at a good future. Jean then saves Hanji from the jaws of the Cart Titan. This is a far cry from his start in Trost, where Jean was cowering in terror at having to face the Titans for the first time. Now he willingly jumps in the way of one to save somebody. The traumas of the last few months have shaped Jean into the sharp soldier he never thought he'd have the chops to be. Something he, for once, proved himself wrong in. And the irony of it all, in his quest to be the furthest thing from Eren Yeager, is through this, Jean becomes the person that I think Eren Yeager wished he was. But it also pushes him ever closer to knowing just how much sacrifice is needed for victory, testing him again and again.